Thank you everyone for joining us. The clue is in the title, NEC4 Managing for Success. So it's a fairly punchy title, which hopefully we can steer you through how to have a successful NEC4 project rather than an unsuccessful one. Before we look at some of the detail, a little bit of housekeeping. As you would expect, slides will be available afterwards. This is being recorded. I'll try not to swear, noting that. And there'll also be the chance to ask questions at the end if we have time. It's a fairly packed agenda, but we will try and take questions at the end. And if you do have a question, please drop it into the Q&A box and we'll see if we have time to deal with that. So onto the agenda, there are 4 things that we will cover this afternoon. I'll talk you through how to start off on the right foot. I'll hand over to Alex that will deal with some of the day-to-day issues that crop up on NEC projects. Lena will deal with compensation events and how they may affect you. And then I'll pick up at the end looking at time and money claims. So the right foot. The NEC has loads of contracts. The key 3 ones that we often see are the engineering and construction contract, the term service contract, and the professional service contract. Obviously, when you kick off with your project, it's important to use the right one. It may be that if you have a fairly simple project, you don't need any of these long form contracts, and you can use the ECC short form or the TSC short form or the PSC short form. Similarly, we're starting to see the FM contract being used. That's in its infancy, and Alex will look at that in a little bit more detail. And similarly, the alliancing contract is something that the NEC has trailed for a few years. That's taken a little while to take off, but we're also starting to see that. So once you have chosen your contract, there's a little bit for you to do at the outset. The first thing is that there are a number of core clauses in the NEC, and apologies, that seems to be obscured by the text at the top. I can't seem to get rid of that, but that's okay. So there are various clauses within the NEC. Those apply automatically. You don't have to manage which clauses apply to your contract. But sitting underneath that, there is an awful lot for you to do to ensure that you start off on the right foot. The first thing is that the NEC has pages and pages of contract data for you to fill out. And unless that contract data is filled out correctly, that can make it difficult for you, the project manager, and the contractor to manage the contract successfully. And a few examples of things hiding away in the contract data. One is the period for reply. Generally, the NEC prefers things to be done within a fortnight, a 2-week window. That might not be long enough for some of the knottier issues which you can come across on the NEC project. So think about whether 2 weeks is long enough. Sitting alongside that, loads to do on whether you want key dates, sectional completion, delay damages. There are spaces for you to complete, and unless you complete those spaces, these things will not apply to your contract, so you might not be entitled, therefore, to recover delay damages if that's something that is important for you. Similarly, on the defect date, do you want a 12-month period or a 24-month period? You need to include that within the contract data. And the defect correction period, is it a 24-hour period for urgent things or slightly longer for more routine defects? These are for you to introduce into the NEC form. They don't help you along in terms of that. And as a contractor, you'll be very keen to ensure that the assessment intervals are correct for you, whether it's a 30-day period or if it's a quick fit-out contract. It might be that you're moving to a fortnight period for that type of contract. The other issue that to be aware of, there are a couple of traps around compensation events and additional employer liabilities, which Lena will deal with. And there's a little quirk hiding away in contract data part 2, which is a requirement that to the extent that the contractor is designing an element of the works, that has to be completed. Otherwise, it is a traditional form of contract rather than a contract which has a design element. So moving back to the things that have to be completed before you're on site, We've looked at contract data. You can see on the screen that there are other things that you have to do, in particular, which pricing option is the one that applies to your contract? Is it a fixed price contract? If so, it's option A, target C, and cost plus is E. Sitting alongside those are other options depending upon if it's an activity schedule or something based upon a bill of quants. Then moving down to number 3, there are things that you need to do in terms of the resolving and avoiding disputes options, which sit towards the end of the contract. For most of us on this webinar, W2 will be the important one, which deals with the Housing Grants Act. However, we're starting to see the Disputes Avoidance Board being used within the UK. Historically, that's been something taken from FIDIC and used on international contracts, but that is gaining a bit more traction in the UK market. Moving down to number 4 are the things which are specific to UK contracts, and in particular why UK2 introduces all of that good stuff hiding away in the Construction Act around due dates, pay less notices, etc. Why UK1 deals with project bank accounts. That still is taking a little bit of time to be used by parties on larger projects, but it is there in the form of contract if that's something that's important for you. And why UK3, the Third Party Rights Act, which again is often used by clients and contractors that use the NEC suite. Number 5 is a thorny thing to bear in mind, and this deals with the X clauses. And you'll see at the top of the screen that I've referred to core clauses. The other important thing that you ought to ensure that you take into account when setting up your contract is which X clauses apply to your project. These are secondary, clue in the name, option clauses. They don't apply automatically. You have to tick the box for those clauses which are relevant for you. And when you look through the NEC list, there is an awful lot of option X clauses which you have to think about. And in particular, going through the list, for example, delay damages, you need to tick the box for option X7. If you're a contractor undertaking design and build, it's important you tick the box for X15. Otherwise, there's a significant risk you're signing up to a fitness for purpose contract. And similarly, if you're a contractor, think about option X18, which is the limitation of liability clause as well. But looking through that, there's a lot for you to think about including within your tender docs before they go out and before you have your discussions with your supply chain when agreeing the final price. So back to the list. I said there were 6, and the last area that you need to manage at the outset is whether or not Z clauses will be appropriate. And this can be important for government clients where they have certain statutes that they need to comply with, FOIA, PCR, the procurement regs. Similarly, if you're on a term service contract, you may want to introduce a Z clause. This is where this part of setting up the contract properly is important. So before I hand over to Alex, who will look through the day-to-day management, quick summary from me. To ensure you are managing a successful NEC4 contract at the outset, make sure you choose the right contract and the right pricing option. The contract data correctly sets out the deal that you've agreed with the contractor and or the client, and also have a think about the X and Z clauses to make sure that they are right and appropriate for your project. So I'll hand over to Alex.
Thanks, Stuart. So I'm going to cover the NEC ethos and what that can mean for you, notices, project manager's role, the early warning regime and programmes. I'm going to talk about that in the context of the ECC, but I will look at how they affect the professional service contract, the term service contract and the facilities management contract. For those of you who are here interested in one of those final 3, just to let you know at the beginning, essentially a lot of it is exactly the same. So do please feel that what I'm saying is relevant to you. Before we get going, I'd be interested to know whether people are now using more of the NEC4, the NEC3 still, whether they're using both, or in fact are fairly new to NEC and haven't yet used either of the forms. Okay, so that's interesting. So we've got a fairly even split by the look of it. So some people are using predominantly NEC4, some are still, quite a few are still using NEC3, some using both, and quite a few using neither. Okay, so we'll try and keep a fairly broad approach to what we're saying. Thank you very much. Sorry about that. Just trying to get the equipment working. So the first thing I wanted to talk about was the NEC ethos and how that fits in with what you really need to do. And I think the first thing to think about is, there's no doubt about it, is a paperwork heavy form. And having seen lots of NEC projects now, some of them have gone really, really well and some not quite so well. But I do genuinely believe the ethos does work and the approach does work, but you do have to actually follow what it says. And that is labour intensive. I think contractors on the whole have got to grips with that and do resource it properly. Not all, but most. Employers aren't always quite so good, and I think that perhaps arises from the competitive tender process for their project manager or service manager, because to be competitive, perhaps not quite enough time is able to be factored in. So keep an eye on that when you're looking at tenders if you're a client. The next thing on NEC ethos is clause 10.1 and acting in a spirit of mutual trust and cooperation. I think it's quite easy to assume that has very little impact, but there's been a recent case on this, Van Ord against Dragados, and that came out at the beginning of the month. It's a Scottish case, and they've actually read clause 10.1 as being interconnected with whether Dragados could claim to reduce the rates that Van Ord were being paid. And the court said, we conclude that clauses 10.1 and 63.10 are counterparts. Unless Dragados fulfills its duty to act in a spirit of mutual trust and cooperation, it cannot seek a reduction in the prices. Accordingly, Van Ord has pled a relevant case to go to proof. Evidence can be led to evaluate Dragados's conduct. Did it act in a spirit of mutual trust and cooperation or not? So from that, the court was actually interested in whether mutual trust and cooperation had been applied and was prepared to make a decision based on it. Now, a note of caution on that was a Scottish case, and Scottish law has an obligation of good faith, where English law doesn't. But even so, I think when you look at that against the Costain and Tarmac case in 2017, which was an English case, you can see the court beginning to look to apply a similar approach. And in that case, the judge didn't have to make a decision on that. And so it chose not to, the court chose not to, but I think there's a good chance that when we see this come through next time, that in fact, the English courts will take a similar approach. The next thing I want to cover is notices. So the first thing to note is an NEC4 point. So NEC4 includes the idea of a communication system. And that is simply a reference back to the scope, and you set out how it is in the scope that you want the parties to communicate. Make sure you follow it if there is one. If there isn't one, make sure you agree up front how you are going to communicate with each other. In terms of the period for reply, which Stuart's already mentioned, if the project manager, supervisor or contractor has to reply to a communication, they have to do it within the period for reply, which is 2 weeks. That's important because actually if you don't reply within the period for reply, you can end up missing deadlines, which can have a deeming effect on some parts of the contract, and it's therefore pretty important. Clause 13.4 sets out how to reply. There are 2 options. You can either accept a communication from the contractor, or you can reject it. The idea of accepted with comments, which you often see in the construction industry, does not fit into the NEC approach. So if you want to make comments, they should be made on a rejected application. And in fact, the contract requires the project manager to explain why it has rejected a communication. So I think that the best way to think about it is either accepted or rejected with comments, and there are no other options. In terms of extending the period for reply, so Stuart mentioned at the beginning that often there's quite a lot to get done in the period for reply. It can be extended under clause 13.5. If you want to do so, either party can ask. One party should write to the other and request a reply, and they should make sure that they get a response to that reply before the end of the existing period for reply. A couple of quirky points towards the end of clause 13. So if the contract requires a notification or a certificate, it has to be communicated separately from other communications under the contract. I think it's probably quite tricky to know whether it's required or not. So probably the easiest thing to do is just to keep all your communications to separate emails, assuming that's the method that you've chosen to communicate. Another one is that if the PM withholds acceptance for a reason stated in the contract, that isn't a compensation event under clause 13.8. So it's quite important when you're rejecting with comments to think about the reason that you give and make sure that it's a reason that's in the contract, because clause 60.19 creates a compensation event if something is rejected for a reason that isn't in the contract. In clause 13, there is wording to confirm that if you withhold acceptance because more information is needed in order to assess the contractor's submission, that is a reason which is accepted. A quick point on the project manager's role. Clause 14.3 says that the project manager may give an instruction to the contractor which changes the scope or a key date. That means that if the parties want to change anything else under the contract, that can't be done by an instruction by the project manager, and the parties need to document that more formally. So, an early warning regime. This is at the heart of the NEC concept and is very important to communication between the parties. When NEC launched NEC4, they commented on this clause because it has been extensively redrafted, and they made the point that actually this has been redrafted to reflect best practice under NEC3. So it wasn't intended to change what should have happened under NEC3, just to make it clear to everybody what we were all getting wrong. And the key point is it's not about liability, it's about communication. So the early warning register shouldn't be listed as an additional compensation event or as an additional client liability in the contract data under either of the forms. There's 4 reasons to notify under the engineering and construction contract. It's because you'll become aware of any matter which could increase the total of the prices, delay completion, delay meeting a key date, or impair the performance of the works in use. Now, it ought to be in everyone's interests to keep the project working well, to give those notifications. If for any reason it may not be, but you should also think about these couple of other points. So contractors, it could affect your right to a compensation event under clause 63.7. So this is a clause from the compensation event regime, and it states that the project manager, if the project manager has stated in the instruction to submit quotations that the contractor did not give early warning, that an experienced contractor could have given, the compensation event is assessed as if the contractor had given the early warning. So good reason for contractors to make sure you get that early warning in. Project managers, note from that clause, if you think the early warning has been missed, you have to say so when you accept the CE and ask for a quotation. Final area I'm going to look at is the programme. Particularly under the engineering and construction contract, it's absolutely key that the programme is looked at properly and runs properly. Note that there's a definition of accepted programme in the contract, which says it's the one identified in the contract data or the last one that's been accepted by the parties. And I think Stuart will come on and talk about this in more detail. And this is an area for clients where they need to make sure that their professionals are have the resources they need to be able to advise on this properly, and for contractors to make sure that the programme works robustly so that you can improve your losses later on. Note in the programme clause 31, there's a little add-on that says the form of the programme should be stated in the scope. What they're thinking of here, and this is an NEC4 wording, I think, what they're thinking about here is what sort of programme format you want, for example. So it's usually a good idea to get programmes in native format as well as in PDF, so you can see what's going on behind the scenes. It may be also that you want to specify how you'd like it laid out, or how it would be most useful for you to look at as a client. And then clause 31 sets out what has to be in the initial programme, and there's lots of points to think about. So beyond what work will be done and when, we've got conditions around any key dates in the contract, provisions for float, time allowances, health and safety requirements, dates when the contractor will need access or acceptances from the client. There should be a statement about how the contractor will do the work, including when principal equipment will be needed, and you can include anything else you want to on the programme in the scope. So there's a lot to make sure is in there, and it's very important, I think, for both parties to do that at the beginning in this first clause 31 programme. The project manager has 2 weeks to accept or reject with comments the programme, and it can do so for a number of reasons. Make sure that the reason it's rejected fits into one of these headings, so not practicable, information missing, just not correct, or doesn't comply with something in the scope. New to NEC4 is that if the project manager doesn't reply after 2 weeks, the contractor can tell the project manager, and the project manager has to reply within 1 week. If he does not, then the programme is deemed accepted, so that will be taken to be the right position. Clause 32 deals with revising programmes, and they will be revised regularly throughout the contract in accordance with the contract data. So you would update each of that long list of things that has to be included on the programmes for these things listed on this slide, so actual progress, plans to deal with delays, and other changes proposed by the contractor. One interesting change from the NEC3 is that the effect of implemented compensation events has been removed from the programme, from this clause, and it shouldn't be included in the programme. And the reason for this is because whether something's a compensation event or not isn't actually relevant to whether it happened or not. So the purpose of the programme becomes showing what has happened and what is going to happen, rather than becoming a tool to discuss liability. And that change has been made based on feedback, because this was a problem in terms of parties managing to keep agreement of programmes going forwards. So having looked at all of that, just see what's happened as with regard to the other contracts. So with a professional service contract, which is the contract you use when you want a professional as opposed to a contractor, so perhaps your project manager or your architect, the clauses that I've talked about are all very similar. So NEC ethos, exactly the same things that apply. On notices, exactly the same clauses apply, and then they've also added an obligation for professionals to retain documents in relation to the project for a period of retention that you set out in the contract. The project manager's role is exactly the same. The early warning regime is very similar. The reasons to notify are very slightly different, but essentially you're expected to operate the early warning regime in the same way as between the consultant and the client. And on programmes, it's more or less the same. There's a few tweaks because professional consultants aren't carrying out works, but actually it looks remarkably similar. So I think the key message on the PSC is, if you're going to use it, be aware that all these things are there and make sure you're operating them properly in the same way as you would with your contractor. On the term service contract, again, these clauses still pretty much apply. So the NEC ethos points all apply absolutely, as and the project notices are exactly the same. The service manager role is very similar, so to the point I made. So the service manager's right to change the contract is limited to the scope, a task, or the affected property. And I'll come on in a second and explain what the task is. The early warning regime, again, is very, very similar with slightly different wording in clause 15.1 about the reasons you can notify an early warning. And then on programmes, there's a slightly lighter version of this for the overview of the tasks, which is called a plan. And then the programmes apply to tasks. So just to explain on tasks, the term service contract envisages that tasks will be called off against it as the contract term progresses. So each individual job will have its own internal programme, which contains or should contain identical issues to the ones that are required for the ECC. And finally, the facilities management contract. Again, very, very similar all the way through. The service manager's role is that he can change the scope or the affected property, but not the rest of the contract. Again, early warning regime, pretty much the same, with a few tweaks on why you can notify. And much like the term service contract, the planning is an overview of the service and the tasks. And the programme is for project orders. So under the facilities management contract, there's an option to allow project orders that you would have to select, which then allows you to have internal, individually identified task projects, as they call it in this form, against which you would have a full programme. So in summary, it looks like mutual trusted cooperation may have some sort of teeth, so do think about that, and that probably means not sticking to the letter of the contract if that isn't, if that means being sharp practice. Contractors, don't forget you're entitled to benefit from the lapses around giving notices via the dealing provisions. Clients and PMs, don't do it. Early warnings, just remember communication and not risk allocation, and that should work fine. And yeah, programmes, make sure they're set up properly at the beginning and kept up to date. I'll hand over to Lena now.
Thank you, Alex. So, as Stuart explained earlier, I have the joys of explaining compensation events to you. So, taken very simply, what is a compensation event? It is an event which, if it occurs, does not arise from the contractor's fault. It entitles the contractor to compensation. Unlike other forms of other standard forms, the NEC considers compensation in both time and money together. So that would be a change in the price, and for time, we're looking at completion dates and effective key dates. And where were we going to find them? Clause 60 defines most of the compensation events. And notice that word, most. You must pay attention to all the clause clauses, the options, and the contract data. And you'll see why I say that later. Broadly speaking, in the ECC, there are 21 compensation events, going down to 16 in the professional skills contract. So we're going to concentrate on the ECC today, and we'll have a look at the other three a little bit later. So the ECC, and there has been a slight change between NEC 3 and 4, and this is the two that you've now got. You've got the project manager notifies the contractor that a quotation for a proposed construction is not accepted, and you have the additional compensation event stated in contract data part 1. So this is where Stuart was talking earlier and was saying about making your contract bespoke for your specific project. If we think about the 4 and managing a few of the common ones that we see, so first we're looking at instructions. So that's the project manager giving an instruction to change the scope. So what could these be? This could be things like deleting or adding work, and you could be looking at an alteration in the work that's going to be completed. You could look at changes in scope, both in terms of the client's and the contractor's design. Why? Because we could be correcting ambiguities, we could be changing what we want, and we may have new client procedures that need to be followed. You'll notice that there are a couple of exceptions though. The first being defects, and that's because defects are dealt with in clauses 45 and 46. And if we included them as a compensation event, there would be a possibility that a client would be able to double recover. But you also need to be aware as a contractor that if you change your scope because you want to or because it doesn't comply with the clients, you will not get a compensation event. And this is so that the scope that sits in the contract data part 1 that's provided by the client takes precedence, which means that you need to be aware of that early. You need to be putting in a compliant tender, scope before tender, and making sure early that you have reviewed what you need. The next one is when the work being done by the client or others on the site interrupts the contractor. And this is very much about early management. So you need to be prepared early if you are the client. So you need to be thinking when you are producing your scope, who's going to be on site? How long are they going to need? What conditions are they going to need? And that feeds into the programme. So as Alex said earlier, the programme is extremely important in an NEC contract. And under clause 31, the contractor will take this information from the scope and will feed this into the accepted programme. However, clients, please be aware. As Alex has said, the accepted programme will change. And we have these horrible demon provisions that the project manager misses the timescales for accepting a programme. So clients and others, do you know how that's changed? And do you know what the consequences will be? This means that there needs to be really good communication between the project manager, the client, and the wider team. Turning next to physical conditions. Notice the drafting. They must be within the site. But obviously in the NEC, ECC, the site is not the only area we're talking about. There are working areas, but this is much narrower. It's just a site. They cannot be weather conditions. And it must be that an experienced contractor would have thought there was such small chances of them occurring that it would be unreasonable to factor them in. So you have to look at this clause alongside 60.2 and 60.3. So 60.2 means that it widens the scope of what the contractor should be considering. For example, where you provided with a survey that said that there should be further testing done, if so, you should probably take that on board because would an experienced contractor have done so? And does that mean that later on you will not be getting a compensation event? If you're a PM, a tip is you turn all of this into a question. Is there an event? Did it occur within the site? Was it weather related? And would an experienced contractor have caught this? And if you're the client, all that wonderful information that you have needs to go in that site information. You need the surveys, you need the as-built, you need the historic data that you hold. And turning next to weather. So unlike standard forms, we're thinking things here like the general term exceptionally adverse weather. You need to know that the NEC is both objective and measured. So in the contract data, you will have the weather data. This is normally collated by an independent third party and it's normally paid for by the client. This will establish the levels of selected relevant conditions for each month and the period of return for more than 10 years. So you will see that you need to have infrequent events. So that means it can't have occurred more common than every 10 years. So something to be aware of as a contractor though, that list is quite narrow. You need to think about whether you want to amend it. How would high winds affect your project? Because they're totally excluded at the moment. And also, as we feel the effects of global warming, should we start to include high temperatures as well as low temperatures? You're thinking things like the Category 4 hurricane in Cambridge, not a sprinkling of snow in the new year. This is one of the areas again, but you're not going to get the difference. You're going to get a difference between the measured weather and the weather data. And a few tricky ones, which cause a few problems when you're coming to manage your contract. An event which is a client liability in these conditions of contract. What does that mean? You need to turn to clause 81 and you'll find this lovely long list of risks that the client's going to manage. Some of them are the normal ones that you would expect. So we're thinking things like damage caused by war, civil war, riots, and civic commotion. But also one to be aware of is the fact that the ECC is not a full transfer of design risk, both the employer design and client design and contractor design. So in there is where you see it. A fault in the design contained in the scope provided by the client is a client liability. Again, it's one to manage, it's one to know your contracts. You take time to prepare them. As Stuart said earlier, you need to know what your contract, which contract is appropriate for you and have these discussions early. The next one is a breach contract by the client, which is not one of the other compensation events. kind of a bit of a scoop up. The NEC describes it as an umbrella which catches all, because their idea is that if this wasn't here, in most jurisdictions, the contractor's only remedy for the breach of contract by the client would be under the law. And the NEC considers that this, along with 63.6, means that the contractor's only remedy is under the contract. Unfortunately, that might be kiboshed because, as Alex has said, the Scottish case has now been decided, in which it made certain decisions about mutual trust and cooperation, and it's kind of made this slightly grey. And we'll have to see what happens to see whether we're able to tell you this in 12 months' time or not. And the next one is additional compensation events stated in the contract data. So this is where you get to bespoke your contract. What risks do you want to transfer? What risks are you prepared to pay for the client to take, to keep, or the contractor to take on? As we've said, there's a lot of documents in an NEC contract, and one of them is a project risk register. And we would say, don't attach this to the contract. Don't risk inadvertently giving CE events away that you don't want to as a client, or accepting risk as a contractor. So turning to the three other forms very quickly, they don't have compensation events you would normally associate with a construction project. So you're thinking physical conditions, items of historic value, and weather. They have a few bespoke ones. So the professional skills contract allows for a consultant to be given time and money for correcting a defect it's not liable for. You will notice a common theme across the three of them, right? When information is corrected, because it was the first lot was provided by the client was incorrect. So you're thinking for the PSC, it's information. For the term services contract, it's a price list. And for the facilities management from the contract, again, it's a price list. But if that needs to be corrected, it's a compensation event against all of them. Alex has also mentioned task orders and affected properties, and these things again come through as compensation events. So now handing over to Stuart, who's very kindly going to explain the managing process of the compensation events.
Lena, loads for you to do. You've heard from Alex on the day-to-day, lots to do there. You've heard from Lena on how you manage compensation events and that list to ensure that you don't inadvertently introduce events. Again, lots for clients and contractors and project managers to think about. Good news is that 10 years ago or so, Judge Ramsey was on top of all of this when he gave us a very good management tip in the case WSP in Dalkia, where he made it quite clear that if you are using the NEC form, and back in the day he would have been talking about the NEC3 from memory, there's a lot to do when the project is live. And probably the most important thing to think about when ensuring that you are managing for success is the underlined words in green, where avoid disputes at the end of the project. And all of the good stuff that Alex has referred to on the day-to-day management should help you avoid disputes at the end of the project. However, if there is a disagreement between the client and the contractor, then Ramsey's advice set out within the Dalkia case is something that we should all aspire to, in that those disputes should be determined whilst the project is live, rather than when everyone's memories put a slightly different spin on things at the end of the job. So with that in mind, there are three things I'll look at in terms of managing compensation events. The first is the notices and the replies to that. Then I'll look at cost, and then quickly look at time at the end of this webinar. So managing notices and replies. To do this, it's important to remember that under the NEC form, there are two ways in which a compensation notice can be notified to the other party. Route A is less adversarial, and this is a notice which is issued by the project manager, and clause 61.1 deals with this type of compensation event. And that should be relatively straightforward. Undoubtedly, the early warning regime that Alex has discussed will be relevant for that. And one of the outcomes of the early warning meeting might well be an instruction issued by the PM. To manage for success, the PM ought to be aware that if something is agreed at the outset and a principle is established for a low value compensation event, that principle will be binding for the remainder of the project. So one thing that we always discuss with clients and PMs is some of the early compensation events or low value compensation events. Are you being overly generous to the contractor? Because if you are, then that is being unfair for the client as and when that project progresses. So that's something to bear in mind, even on the less adversarial compensation event route. Moving on to route B, and in particular clause 61.3 deals with this type of compensation event. This is where the contractor initiates the notice, and the contractor is notifying the project manager that it considers an event has occurred and that event is a compensation event. And in our experience, this is where it can be more difficult to achieve a successful NEC project. So the PM and the contractor should bear a couple of things in mind if 61.3 is relevant for your project. And the first is that as and when a compensation event is being drafted by the contractor, it's important for you to ensure that the notice itself sets out the event clearly and the event is tied to one of the compensation events that Lena has referred to. If the notice isn't clear, the project manager should reject that notice as it doesn't, in our view, comply with the terms of the NEC contract. In many respects, it would be helpful that where a compensation event under 61.3 is being notified, to refer back to the records and the discussions which may have taken place as part of the early warning regime. That should take out some of the emotion from this particular route to achieving a compensation event. So all of the heated discussions hopefully have taken place during the early warning regime, and the outcome of that should provide a little bit more clarity for both parties as they progress through the project itself. There's another little trap for the contractor to be aware of, in that for a number of compensation events, not all of them, but for a number of compensation events, there is an eight-week cut-off period in which it has to serve its compensation event notice. So it's important to ensure that when you're managing successfully from a contractor perspective, that they bear in mind this 8-week window from when the event occurred. And there's a little bit of case law about when do you start the 8-week clock from ticking, but to be on the safe side, I would suggest that contractors should issue that notice as soon as they can. Other things that Alex has touched upon, that when you are notifying a compensation event as a contractor, all of the stuff in clause 13 that Alex referred to, make sure it's in writing, make sure it's a separate notice. And there's lots of software out there, CMAR, etc., which should make that a little bit easier to ensure that you comply with the quirky requirements set out within clause 13. So what happens when a 61.3 notice lands? The PM has to do something upon receipt of that notice, and 61.4 gives us a little bit of guidance as to what the project manager should do upon receipt of a notice. The first thing to note is the project manager does not have much time in which to reply to a compensation event notice. And in essence, within that 1 week, it has to determine whether the event set out within the notice is in fact a compensation event. And there are 4 other tests for the PM to take into account, including whether the event has in fact had an impact on the defined cost. All of that within a fairly short 1 week window. And that's why the day-to-day management is so important for the project manager and for the contractor, because in order to successfully reply within 1 week, we suggest that you need all of the information that has been discussed as part of the early warning regime to enable the project manager to hit that 1 week window. It might be that the PM doesn't have enough information within the 1 week window in which to reach a decision. And in our view, there's nothing wrong with the PM asking for a little bit more time before it reaches a decision as to whether or not a notice set out or an event set out within a notice is in fact a compensation event. And Alex alluded to that earlier, that it's good project management, good relationship between the contractor team and the PM team, where something is complex and complicated, that the PM is given sufficient time in order to investigate that properly. What happens if the PM is silent and it doesn't reply within the 1 week window? Again, the NEC is keen to ensure that the pace of resolving disputes and differences is a keen one, and it gives the contractor the right under 61.4 to issue a nudge notice to the project manager stating, I haven't heard from you within the week. And that nudge notice gives the project manager a further 2 weeks in which to reply. And if it doesn't reply, then similar to the accepted program discussion that Alex referred to earlier, it will automatically be deemed to be a compensation event. And that is why, for successful management of the compensation event regime, you must keep on top of the timelines and the records to ensure that you can meet the various timescales set out within the NEC contract. If we then assume that the project manager accepts that the event set out within a notice is in fact a compensation event, you move into the quotation element of clause 60, and that starts with clause 62.2. And under clause 62.2, the contractor, as Lena has referenced earlier, is entitled to recover time and money for each of those 21 events set out within the ECC. And I'll move on to look at how cost is dealt with under that quotation regime. So dealing with cost first, 63.1 is the clause that determines how the cost effect of a compensation event is assessed. And in our view, out of all of the clauses within the NEC form, this is probably the key mechanic to get right to ensure that you have a successful NEC4 project. And it can be a little bit fiddly. If you look at the words under 63.1, they deal with three separate elements. The first being your actual defined cost, the second being forecast defined cost, and the third being the fee which attaches to those two previous elements. And in order to put forward an accurate quotation for a compensation event, the contractor will need to understand the dividing date which determines whether its quotation is based upon actual defined cost, which has already been incurred, as opposed to forecast defined cost, which it has not yet incurred. And that, in our experience, can be very fiddly indeed. So a couple of tips to ensure that this element is managed successfully, in that most compensation events will be based upon forecast defined cost. The NEC is a look forward contract. As and when an event occurs, you look forward to assess what the effect is likely to be on the program and the defined cost. And in order for the contractor within 3 weeks to accurately forecast its defined cost, undoubtedly it will need to be on top of the records it wants to rely upon to put forward a credible forecast. And this is very important for the contractor, because if the contractor undersells the effect of the forecast, it is bound by that quotation and it cannot move away from that quotation once it's been implemented by the project manager. So there's an awful lot of risk placed upon the contractor to ensure that its quotation is accurate. Similarly, there's a lot of pressure on the project manager to respond to that quotation within the 2-week window. And that is why, in order to enable the response to be an effective one, it's important to go back to the early warning regime and the records and the discussions which should have taken place as part of the day-to-day contract management. The other issue for the contractor is that it needs to include a time risk allowance within its forecast. And again, that places a little bit more pressure on the contractor to ensure that is an accurate forecast. A couple of tools that the PM has available to it, and that is that when it is assessing the compensation event, it should take into account whether or not the contractor is acting promptly and reacting promptly to the event itself. It can also rely upon asking for revised quotations and building in assumptions to that mechanic. And in our experience, if there's a degree of uncertainty, then asking the contractor for a revised quotation and or relying upon an assumption helps to reduce the uncertainty between the parties. Again, as I mentioned, there's lots to do within 2 weeks. If the contractor submits a nudge notice under 62.6 and the PM fails to respond to that, the PM is deemed to have accepted the contractor's quotation. So back to Ramsey, he's told us this is what we need to do, and certainly we can achieve that, but there's an awful lot for all of you to do within a fairly short period of time under the NEC form, and that is on cost alone. So we query whether or not the periods for reply, the 2 weeks, etc., are in fact accurate and are practicable on a very complex engineering project. So moving briefly onto time, I'm afraid it doesn't get any easier when assessing the effect of a compensation event on the accepted programme. And clause 63.5 gives some guidance as to what the project manager and the contractor are required to do in relation to time. And there's an awful lot to do within the NEC in order for the contractor to demonstrate that it is entitled to an extension to the planned completion date. And it has to do all of this alongside the cost element of the quotation within a 3-week window. But as I mentioned earlier, hopefully none of this will come as a surprise to the parties, and the early warning regime and the early warning meetings will help to set the scene somewhat. So how does that work out in practice? If we take a few examples, so if we assume that Alex's clause 31 and 32 programs are the day-to-day programs, if a compensation event occurs, the contractor issues under 62.2 its assessment of the effect of that compensation event on the program. And both parties in doing so should identify the effect of the event itself on incomplete operations. And that can be quite fiddly from a factual perspective, but both parties are required to do that either within 3 weeks or within 2 weeks. But if we assume it's a fairly simple event and it's pretty clear that the planned completion is kicked out by 3 weeks due to this compensation event, then the project manager implements the 62 program under clause 66 of the NEC, and that is then baked in to the next accepted program, which is part of the day-to-day regime, which Alex looked at. And the NEC works quite well for a standalone, fairly simple compensation event. However, if you have a number of compensation events or a very complex compensation event which arises, that 3-week and 2-week window is almost impossible to comply with in order to have an accurate forecast of the effect of the event on the remainder of the program itself. So that is where we start to see people thinking dealing with time is too tricky, and they start to shelve time sometimes quite early on in the life of a project. And in our view, in order for an NEC project to be a success, you must keep on top of the programme, even if it means being involved in difficult conversations. It becomes even trickier if there is no accepted programme. So here in this example, the accepted programme, for whatever reason, hasn't been agreed and it's fallen by the wayside. And in order to assess the effect of the compensation event, the NEC asks us to go back to the previous accepted programme and to fill in the gaps between the previous accepted programme and the date in which the event occurs. And that can be very fiddly indeed and almost impossible to achieve within the 3-week and the 2-week window. Other issues then arise when there is a disagreement between the parties. So if we go back to our initial compensation event, the contractor considers there was a 3-week delay. PM thinks 3 weeks is a bit too generous. I believe it's 2 weeks. The project manager then implements its own assessment under clause 64. That is implemented under clause 66, and that should then feed into the accepted programme as and when the contract progresses. But if the contractor digs in on that, that leaves you in a difficult position in that you have a disagreement under the accepted programme between the contractor team and the PM team, and that is when the accepted programme starts to unravel. So to get round that, the PM should step into the contractor's shoes and implement its own accepted programme under clause 64. And again, the wording in NEC is pretty clear on this, but in practice, we seldom see PMs wishing to take over control of the contractor's accepted programme. And that is when, if you start to have a disagreement, that's when time can be parked and results in issues trying to be resolved at the end of a project rather than during the life of the project itself. The other issue to be aware of is that if the PM disagrees with the contractor's assessment, it should step in and issue its own PM assessment. If you don't have a PMA, if you don't have an accepted programme, you are unlikely to be able to successfully manage an NEC project. So moving on to the final slide, in our views, summarising everything that Alex has talked through, that Lena has talked through, and that I've whittled on about, our observations from working with clients on live projects is that to have a successful NEC project, undoubtedly you need a good contractor, but you also need a very good PM team. And by that we mean both teams are willing to be proactive and responsive, and there is a good rapport between them. If you don't have that, it's less likely that you will have a successful project. Similarly, take on board Ramsey's view that deal with issues in a grown-up way as and when they arise during the life of the project. And to have the best chance of succeeding with that, it's important to keep good records and to be on top of the day-to-day management that Alex referred to. And finally, it's definitely our view that for a successful project, you must keep on top of the programme at all times, even if it means a difficult conversation early on in the life of the project. Don't allow the programme to be sidelined, to be dealt with at a later point in time. So that summarises our little bit. It says any questions. I'm conscious the time is 5 o'clock. So I'm looking at Alex and Lena. It may be that we deal with them in a blog or write an answer or something else. So we'll deal with those probably offline. Sarah and Katie are on the call, and I'm contractually obliged to remind people that there are upcoming webinars. There's one to the end of November that looks at COP26 and building towards net zero, and another one in mid-December where Alison and Duncan will look at health and safety in the construction industry. And the arm twisting goes on in that I'm also asked to ask for feedback, and apparently we have a blog I knew about the blog. I'm joking. Hopefully Alison's on the call. And just to advertise our LinkedIn group as well, which has lots of good stuff. So thank you very much for attending this afternoon. I hope you found it useful, and we will see you again soon.